when did science fiction begin? Conventional wisdom says it starts with Frankenstein, a novel published by Mary Shelley when she was just 19 years old. She started the book in the summer of 1816 while vacationing near Lake Geneva in Switzerland with her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet Lord Byron, and Byron's personal physician, John Polidori. It was a notoriously cold year as a result of an 1815 volcanic eruption in Indonesia that caused climate deterioration for about 3 years. In Europe, 1816 was known as the year without a summer. As a result of the weather, the writers gathered together and often spent a lot of time indoors, and on one of those nights, they sat around telling scary stories. At the end of the evening, they all agreed to write their own scary story. Shelley's husband and Lord Byron never wrote books of their own about any of those scary stories, but Mary Shelley finished Frankenstein and published it 2 years later in 1818. It was inspired in part because of a nightmare she had of a scary figure hovering over her in her bed, much like the image in Henry Fuseli's painting, The Nightmare, which he painted in the late 1790s. Fuseli also had a romantic relationship with Mary Shelley's mother, political philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft. The other book to come from that night of scary stories was John Polidori's story, The Vampire, which was the first vampire story published in the English language. Mary Shelley's novel is often considered the first science fiction story in the English language for several reasons. First, Mary Shelley was well read in the area of emerging science related to electricity, chemistry, biology, and anatomy. In other words, she was heavily influenced by science, as was her book. Second, her monster is clearly the result of a scientific experiment, not the result of magic. Some people argue that Frankenstein is not a science fiction novel because the science is more like alchemy, and so it's unrealistic and mystical. But although we often value realism in science fiction stories and movies, there are many stories that are still considered science fiction in which the science has been deemed impossible. Third, her novel explores the theme of unintended consequences of scientific experiment and progress, a theme that goes on to dominate the science fiction tradition today. Fourth, people argue that it is the first science fiction story because it's the one the science fiction tradition recognizes as the first. This argument is a bit circular, but it still has merit. If our modern science fiction tradition is responding to Frankenstein as its origin, then in some ways, Frankenstein becomes its origin. However, there were stories before Frankenstein, stories that Frankenstein itself might have been in conversation with, and a true historical look at speculative fiction should consider a few additional foremothers and even some forefathers.